It was the second Friday of October, 2017. The air outside was too still, and the scattered leaves on the pavement looked less like autumn decor and more like bones left behind. I didn't know it then, but that babysitting job would become the worst night of my life. I was 19, broke, and desperate for extra cash. That's how I ended up driving down Osprey Road, a wealthy, isolated neighborhood where every house looked like a magazine cover and felt completely lifeless inside. The Hayes family had called last minute. Their usual sitter canceled. Mrs. Hayes met me at the door, dressed sharp, her eyes cold and calculating. "The boys are in bed," she said, handing me a list of emergency numbers and a Wi-Fi password. Then she led me to a small screen in the kitchen, showing 8 camera feeds, every corner of the house under surveillance. Her tone shifted. "One important rule, Sarah," she said quietly. "Never touch the cameras. Ever. They're tied to the alarms. If you adjust one, the police will come." It sounded absurdly strict, but her stare told me she wasn't joking. Moments later, the front door sealed behind her, leaving me in a silence so heavy it pressed against my ears. The boys, Ethan and Lucas, were asleep upstairs. I checked on them just to be sure. Ethan's room was dark, minimal. Lucas's nursery glowed faintly with a whale-shaped nightlight. But what caught my eye was the camera mounted high on the wall, not pointed at the crib, but at the window and door, like it was watching the room's perimeter instead of the kid inside. I brushed it off and went back downstairs. The house hummed with quiet mechanical noises, refrigerator, heating system, the subtle whine of electronics in standby. Around 9:30, my podcast was interrupted by a new sound. A sharp whirring, followed by a faint clatter from the kitchen. I followed it to find an automatic pet feeder in the corner. A few brown pellets of kibble had scattered across the tile. Only, there was no pet. No dog bowl, no litter box. The house didn't smell like animals. I texted my friend Mia. "Me, the pet feeder just went off. But there's no pet. Mia, lol, haunted by ghost dogs." I laughed, but uneasily. As I turned to glance at the screen of camera feeds, something flickered on the front lawn. A dark, low movement near the oak tree. Gone in a blink. Maybe a cat. Maybe not. Then I noticed the nursery feed. The camera that had been facing the window was moving silently, panning downward until it stopped, centered perfectly on an empty rocking chair. My stomach tightened. It didn't feel like a glitch. Someone was controlling it. I remembered Mrs. Hayes' warning, "Don't touch the cameras." But now, I couldn't shake the idea that someone else was watching from the other side, watching me. Trying to calm myself, I climbed the stairs again. Lucas's room was dim, peaceful. His soft breathing filled the space. But when I looked at the camera, still aimed at the rocking chair, I noticed something else. A thin, dark cable running behind it, up through the baseboard and into the wall. It wasn't a power cord. It looked organic, flexible, and faintly warm when I touched it. Then came a new sound, a soft hiss from above, like static at first, then breathing. Wet, ragged, and close. That's when it hit me. The sound wasn't coming from the vents, it was coming from the camera. Someone or something was breathing into the room through the audio feed. My brain split between logic and panic. The Hayes had said the cameras were linked to alarms, but what if that was just an excuse to keep people from discovering what they were really used for? I stumbled back, trembling. Something was being watched, fed, monitored. I thought of the pet feeder downstairs. Maybe it wasn't a glitch at all. I ran to the kitchen. The house's silence felt like it was listening. Then, whir clatter. The feeder went off again. I checked the clock. 10:45 p.m. The same exact sound as before. I turned to the monitor, cycling through the camera feeds. And there it was. Something moved on the driveway camera low to the ground, jerky, almost insect-like. Its limbs were too long, its body too thin. As it crept closer to the porch, its face caught the light. The eyes were round, glassy, and too large for its skull. Its mouth hung open, its jaw stretched like something broken. It sniffed the air, then turned toward the side of the house, where the foundation met the shrubs. I watched, paralyzed, as it crawled toward the metal grate on the wall. The air vent. Its long, clawed hand began picking at the edges, trying to pry it loose. That's when it all clicked. The cameras, the rule, the feeder. The Hayes weren't watching me for safety, they were studying it. feeding it, containing it. The nursery camera wasn't focused on Lucas. It was focused on the vent, the entry point. The hissing sound in the baby's room wasn't static. It was breathing from inside the walls. I bolted for the door. I sprinted downstairs, my heartbeat pounding louder than my footsteps. Every instinct screamed, "Get out!" But something deep inside me, some awful, human need to know, made me glance once more at the screen. The driveway feed showed the creature now halfway through the vent, its body writhing like something boneless. The security camera's night vision turned it a sickly shade of green, making it look less like an animal and more like a mistake of nature, too long, too thin, too hungry. I froze as the feeder whirred again, releasing more kibble onto the tile. It wasn't food for a dog, it was bait. I felt sick. My brain pieced it together in flashes, the camera in the nursery facing the vent, the strange cable running through the wall, the rule about never touching the cameras. The Hayes didn't want anyone interfering with their system, because that system wasn't just security, it was containment. Something was living in their walls, and they were feeding it. I ran to the door, fumbling with the digital lock. My hands were slick with sweat. Behind me, the sound of metal bending echoed through the walls, the air vent being forced open. I didn't dare look. I unlocked the door and slipped outside into the cold night air. I slammed the door behind me and locked it from the keypad, sealing the thing inside. I ran to my car, my legs trembling so badly I nearly dropped the keys. When I finally got the engine started, I floored it out of the driveway, tires crunching over the gravel. I didn't stop until the glowing sign of the police station appeared down the street. Inside, I tried to explain about the cameras, the feeder, the creature. My words came out in fragments. They listened, calm and professional, jotting down notes like they'd heard far crazier stories before. They sent a unit to check on the house. I waited in the lobby, hands shaking uncontrollably, staring at the clock. Every minute that passed, I imagined that thing moving through the vents, crawling into the children's rooms. After an hour, the officers came back. "There's no sign of forced entry," one said. "The Hayes family returned home shortly after you left. They explained the situation, said they have a rare dog kept in a controlled enclosure, fed through an automated system. The cameras, the cables, the noise, all part of their air filtration setup." He gave a sympathetic half smile. "They were polite, but they mentioned you left the kids unattended and filed a false report. They'll be contacting their attorney." I sat there, staring blankly at the floor. They had an answer for everything. A rare dog, an air system, a glitching camera. Perfect, reasonable lies. But deep down, I knew the truth. I knew the difference between a glitch and intent between an animal and the thing I saw crawling through that vent. I never contacted the Hayes again. Never went back to Osprey Road. For weeks, I couldn't sleep without checking my walls for movement or listening for the sound of faint, wet breathing behind the vents. My nightmares weren't about the creature itself, they were about the people who owned it. Because that's what really stayed with me. How calm they were. How prepared. They weren't shocked when I ran. They didn't call me. They didn't chase me down. Because I wasn't the first. Their system, their cameras, their feeder, it was already programmed. Routine. They were feeding something, and all I'd done was interrupt dinner. A few days later, I got a text from an unknown number. No name, no emojis, just one word. Hungry. I tried to tell myself it was a cruel joke. Maybe Mia messing with me. But the number wasn't hers. I blocked it immediately. Still, I couldn't shake the thought that someone or something was reminding me it was still waiting. I moved out of state the following month, started college, and tried to rebuild a normal life. But even now, every October, when the nights start to get too quiet, I think about that house, its glass walls, the hum of its machines, the glowing monitors showing every inch of darkness. Sometimes I imagine the next babysitter stepping inside, smiling politely as Mrs. Hayes walks her through the rules. The same cold tone, the same warning, never touch the cameras, and somewhere beneath their polished floors, in the crawl space or the ducts, something ancient and hungry shifts awake, listening for the familiar whir of the feeder. The thing on Osprey Road doesn't hunt, it doesn't need to, it's fed. And every few nights, when I close my eyes, I still hear that sound. Whir, clatter, followed by the soft, wet hiss of something breathing too close to the microphone. My second summer break from university, I decided I needed a change from babysitting for families I already knew. I signed up for a service called Sitter Connect, a kind of high-end, vetted referral site. That's how I met the Petersons. They lived in one of those new, identical cul-de-sacs that had sprung up on the outskirts of the city, a place with no established trees, all fresh concrete, and houses so close you could hear the neighbors' arguments. Their house was number 14. Mrs. Peterson was the overreactor. She was a whirlwind of nervous energy, her hands constantly fluttering. The moment I walked in, she was apologizing profusely for the state of the house, which was immaculate. The fact I was there, even though she hired me, and the sheer difficulty of parenting their daughter, 5-year-old Lily. "She's a sensitive soul," Mrs. Peterson whispered, leading me down the hall to the immaculate pink and white bedroom. "She hasn't been sleeping well. She has night terrors. She's seeing things." I nodded, maintaining my calm, matter-of-fact demeanor. Kids see things all the time. Imagination, shadows, a need for attention. "And you must not, under any circumstances," Mrs. Peterson continued, her voice tightening, "let her look out the window after dark." I blinked. "The bedroom window?" "Any window, really," she said, practically wringing her hands. "But especially the big bay window in the living room. It just makes things worse for her." Mr. Peterson, the skeptic, finally cut in. He was a broad man with a permanently tired expression. "It's just the shadows, Sarah. She gets spooked. My wife gets dramatic. We're going to a work dinner. Be back by 11:30. Pizza's in the fridge. Emergency numbers are right there." The rule was strange, but manageable. I accepted it without question. Got it. No windows after dark. Lily was already asleep, clutching a well-loved, slightly stained, stuffed bunny. The house settled into a standard hum after the parents left. I grabbed the cold pizza, put on a documentary about ancient history, and started my surveillance routine. The setup was simple. Lily's room was at the back of the house. The hallway was dark, and the door was kept ajar. The windows in the living room, the restricted bay window, looked out onto the cul-de-sac. At around 8:30 p.m., the documentary was talking about Roman emperors when a sound pulled me out of my relaxed state. It was a thump, 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 coming from upstairs, directly above the kitchen. I paused the TV, listening intently. It wasn't the sound of running or falling, it was rhythmic, like a small, heavy object being deliberately bounced. I went into the hall, looking up. The only room upstairs was the attic, accessed by a pull-down ladder in the ceiling. It was silent now. I told myself it was settling, or the heating unit. But then, a few seconds later, it started again. Thump, thump, thump. 3 distinct bounces, and then silence. I walked to the bottom of the attic ladder, looking up at the closed white panel. I reached up and pulled it down slightly, just enough to see a sliver of darkness. "Hello?" I called out, keeping my voice low. "Lily?" No answer. Just the sudden, absolute silence of the rest of the house. I pulled the ladder fully down and started to climb. I had to know. The curiosity was too strong. The attic air was thick and warm, smelling of stale wood and forgotten insulation. I flicked the light switch, and a single, weak bulb illuminated a small, open space lined with boxes. It was much cleaner than I expected. Most of the boxes were clearly labeled with dates and contents, Christmas decorations, tax records, old college textbooks. I walked slowly through the center of the room. Nothing seemed out of place. The ceiling was low, and I had to duck slightly. Where the sound had come from, I found the only thing that didn't belong with the labeled storage. A heavy, black rubber ball, the size of a softball, resting innocently on the bare plywood floor. I picked it up. It was cold, slightly tacky, and surprisingly heavy. It explained the thump. But who had been up here to bounce it? Lily was downstairs, asleep, and I hadn't heard the attic ladder open or close. As I put the ball down, I noticed a detail I had missed because of the clutter of the other boxes. Tucked neatly against the far eave, almost flush with the roofline, were 3 small, identical cardboard boxes. Unlike the rest, these were unmarked. The uncertainty in me was now battling with my calm thinker voice. "Don't touch them. It's not your business." But the weird sound, the mysterious ball, and the intensity of Mrs. Peterson's rule about the windows all felt connected. I crouched down and picked up the first box. It was light. I opened the lid. Inside was a single object, a child's drawing done in thick, dark crayon. It was a crude depiction of the Peterson family, Mr. and Mrs. Peterson, Lily, all holding hands, smiling with overly large, bright red mouths. But on the far edge of the paper, drawn in a shaky, unsettling brown, was a tall, angular, featureless shape. It stood just outside the family circle. The drawing was simple, but the shape gave me a jolt of anxiety. I closed the box and opened the second one. Inside, there was another drawing. This one was all black and gray. It showed a single bay window, clearly the one downstairs. And pressed up against the glass, drawn with heavy, smudged charcoal, was a pair of hands. Long, thin fingers stretched out, seemingly trying to claw their way through the glass. The caption, scrawled beneath it in Lily's uncertain handwriting, read, "He is watching me." I felt a genuine spike of fear. This wasn't normal night terror drawing. This was specific, and it perfectly mirrored the mother's frantic rule. Then I opened the third box. It was heavier. Inside, resting on a bed of tissue paper, was the object that made my stomach drop. It was a single, small, tarnished, silver earring, shaped like a tiny crescent moon. I immediately recognized it. It was identical to the earring I had seen hanging from Mrs. Peterson's ear when she opened the door. It wasn't one of Lily's toys. It was her mother's. Why was a single, expensive earring, along with two of Lily's deeply unsettling drawings, hidden in an unmarked box in the attic? The mother's overreactor demeanor and the father's skeptic dismissal suddenly felt less like personality quirks and more like a planned, synchronized act of denial. I quickly replaced the boxes, climbed back down the ladder, and closed it with a shaking hand. I returned to the living room, my heart hammering. My reflection in the dark bay window looked back at me, a face etched with anxiety and growing dread. The time dragged toward 10:30 p.m. I couldn't concentrate on the TV. I kept replaying the attic scene, the rhythmic thumping, the drawings, the mother's missing earring. I was now caught in a web of curiosity and fear. I needed to know what was outside. The mother's rule had become a magnet. I stood up and walked toward the bay window. I approached it slowly, moving along the wall so that I wouldn't cast a shadow. The streetlights of the new cul-de-sac were weak, throwing long, exaggerated shadows from the construction debris and the few sickly-looking saplings planted in the lawn. The glass was cold. I pressed my forehead against it, just on the side panel, and looked out. The cul-de-sac was a perfect semicircle. It was silent, empty. Nothing moved. Just the identical houses, their windows mostly dark, reflecting the streetlights. I let out a long, shaky breath, the calm thinker winning back a small piece of territory. It was just an overly imaginative kid and a neurotic mom. The drawings were just a child's way of expressing anxiety. The earring was probably dropped. The thump was an animal. I was exhausted, and my mind was making connections that weren't there. I turned from the window. Just as I was walking away, my eyes caught a flash of light. It came from across the cul-de-sac. House number 11. The house directly across from the Petersons. The light was instantaneous. A quick, blinding flash of white, like a camera flashbulb. It was too fast to be a headlight or a porch light turning on. It was a single, clear, photographic flash. I froze. I slowly walked back to the window, this time pressing myself against the wall, peering out from the shadows. Nothing. House 11 was dark. I waited for a full minute. My breath held tight in my chest. Flash. There it was again. Clear, white, and unmistakable. It came from an upstairs window in House 11. It was an intermittent camera taking long exposure photographs. But of what? They were facing the Peterson house. And they were coming from a house that was supposed to be empty. House 11 had a for sale sign planted in its front lawn. This was the terrifying twist. The rule wasn't about Lily looking out. It was about what was outside, looking in. I started to experience genuine panic. Lily's drawing came back to me, the long, clawed hands on the glass. The "he is watching me" caption. The fear was real, not just a childish fantasy. Someone was across the street, in an empty house, using a camera with a flash. And then I saw the movement. A silhouette appeared suddenly in the upstairs window of House 11, the source of the flash. It was too tall to be a person standing normally. It seemed to fill the entire frame of the window, and it wasn't moving around the room. It was moving up, slowly. The silhouette had long, thin arms, stretched above its head as if bracing itself against the ceiling. It was impossibly high. The shape was thin, unnervingly angular, and then the head appeared, a dark, round shape, perfectly centered in the window frame. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't a shadow. It was a person, or something trying to look like a person, standing on something, or climbing the inside wall, just to get a specific view. The overreactor mom wasn't neurotic. She was terrified. The skeptic dad wasn't tired. He was in denial. They knew about the viewer. I couldn't scream. My throat was paralyzed. I was staring directly into the place where a face should have been. And then, the shape raised its hand, slowly, deliberately, and waved. A long, unnatural gesture. I threw myself back from the window, stumbling over the ottoman, the loud thud finally breaking the spell of silence. I scrambled for my phone, fingers shaking as I tried to dial 911. Before I could, I heard a quiet sound from down the hall. A small, distressed whimper. Lily. I couldn't just leave her. The guilt of an experienced babysitter warred with the primal survival instinct. I chose the child. I ran down the hall, pulling the door to Lily's room open. The Whale nightlight was on. Lily was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide, glassy, and fixed on the window. She wasn't screaming. She was breathing in short, terrified bursts. "Lily, what is it?" I whispered, rushing to her. She didn't look at me. She only pointed a trembling finger at her window, the back window, which looked out onto the fenced backyard. "He's closer," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "He wants the bunny." I looked toward the window. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't see the silhouette. I saw a long, deep scratch on the glass, starting at the top and running down, as if a large, curved hook had been dragged across it. The scratch was new. It hadn't been there before. The scratch led my eyes to the edge of the window frame, and there, tucked into the sill, was a small, familiar object. It was the black, heavy rubber ball I had found in the attic. It hadn't been bounced by an animal. It hadn't been left there by the parents. The rhythmic thump, thump, thump had been a signal. It was a communication tool. The thing outside was communicating with the thing in the empty house. Or, even worse, the thing in the empty house was sending a message to the thing in the attic. The realization hit me. They were communicating across the cul-de-sac, in a terrifying, synchronized game. One was the viewer, the other was the feeder. And the children's room was the central node. I grabbed Lily, pulling her into a tight embrace, and stumbled toward the door. I had to get her out of the house. As I did, I heard the sound of the front door opening downstairs. A brief, light click of the lock, and the faint scraping of shoes on the tile. The Petersons were back. Early. "Lily, we're home, sweetheart," Mrs. Peterson called out, her voice cheerful, high-pitched. Too cheerful. I ran out of the room. Lily clutched to my chest and started down the stairs. Mr. Peterson was standing at the bottom, looking up. He was no longer the tired skeptic. His face was cold, blank, and terrifyingly neutral. "You weren't supposed to look out the window, Sarah," he said, his voice flat. "That was the only rule. And you know what happens when you break the only rule." I stopped dead, halfway down the staircase, frozen between the terror of the viewer outside, the child in my arms, and the blank, terrifying stare of the father below. This was the final, devastating climax of psychological horror. The realization that the danger wasn't to the family, it was the family itself. They knew. They were the architects of the fear. They were part of the game. I don't know what I would have done if the door hadn't burst open behind Mr. Peterson at that moment. A neighbor, a woman I had seen a few times, rushed in, her face etched with panic. I heard a smash from house. "11!" she cried, looking frantically between the Petersons and me. "Someone is breaking in." I called the police. The neighbor's unexpected arrival shattered the tense tableau. "Mr." Peterson swore, a look of sudden, genuine panic replacing his neutral facade. He looked at the neighbor, then at me, then back at the neighbor. "Take the child, Sarah. Get out," he yelled, suddenly rushing toward the front door, not to protect his family, but to deal with the break-in at House 11. It was his property being disturbed, not his daughter. I didn't need a second invitation. I shoved past the neighbor and bolted out of the house, clutching Lily. I ran into the cul-de-sac. The neighbor followed, still shouting. We huddled by the neighbor's car, watching. Mr. Peterson was gone, vanished into the shadows between the houses. Mrs. Peterson was now standing on her porch, her hands over her mouth, but she wasn't crying. She was watching the darkness of House 11 with an expression of profound, awful anticipation. The police arrived quickly. They found nothing at House 11. No broken windows, no sign of entry, just a light left on in the upstairs room. A final, cruel twist. The neighbor's call was likely triggered by the thing in House 11, which had heard the commotion and decided to make its own play. Lily and I were separated. I gave my statement, insisting on the drawings, the earring, the silhouette, and the scratch on the glass. The police found the drawings in the attic. Lily was questioned about them. She was immediately whisked away by her aunt, who was presented as the calm thinker in the family, a figure of stability brought in to contain the situation. I was released, my reputation in tatters, the story dismissed as exaggeration due to stress. A week later, I got a registered letter from the Petersons' attorney. It was a cease and desist order, accusing me of defamation and trespassing. It was accompanied by a check for the full amount of my wages and a small official-looking document, a deed transfer. The Petersons had purchased House 11 the day after I left. The for sale sign had been a decoy. The true horror of the experience is this. I realized the Petersons weren't victims of a stalker. They were the stalkers, or they were facilitating one. They bought the house across the street just to have the perfect vantage point. The mother's rule was to train Lily not to look outside, so she wouldn't interfere with the viewer's terrifying ritual. Lily's final words, whispered into my ear as her aunt led her away, solidified my persistent fear. He's got a new house now, Sarah. He can see all of me. I never slept well again with my window uncovered. I'm haunted by the thought that somewhere, on a quiet new cul-de-sac, two houses sit across from each other, perfectly aligned, and someone is waiting, high in an empty window, his long, thin arms waving a silent greeting, watching a child a ritual of terror I will never be able to unsee. It was the summer of 2019, and I thought I'd finally learned my lesson about babysitting. No more random families, no more sketchy ads. I only took jobs through trusted references now. That's how I met Maria Reyes, a single mother with deep eye bags, the smell of coffee permanently clinging to her clothes, and a house that looked like it belonged in an old photograph. Her neighbor, my friend Chloe, swore Maria was nice but strange. I figured that was fine. I'd seen stranger. Maria lived in a small old house in the historic part of town. The air inside was thick with that antique kind of warmth, creaking floors, dim lamps, the faint scent of wood and lemon cleaner. Her son, Julian, was 2 years old, a quiet, dark-haired little boy who slept soundly as we peeked into his crib. Before she left for her late-night job, Maria sat me down and handed me a laminated list of rules. It was written in tight, spidery handwriting, and it felt more like a ritual than babysitting instructions. Do not touch the thermostat. The temperature must always stay at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Do not open the windows. They're sealed shut. Do not let Julian leave the hall rug. If he wakes, sit with him on the rug until he sleeps again. At 3 a.m., check the front door, press your ear to it for 10 seconds. Then go to the kitchen, touch the back doorknob for 10 seconds. She caught my skeptical look and gave a nervous smile. I know it's weird. Just stick to the routine. It helps him sleep. At 9 p.m., she left. The house exhaled into silence. I made tea, curled up with a book, and tried to ignore how the place seemed to listen as I moved. Everything was fine until 1 a.m. when I heard faint movement from Julian's room. He wasn't crying, just standing there in his crib, staring at the door with wide, glassy eyes. When he saw me, he lifted his arms silently, wanting out. I set him down on the hall rug, a large Persian-style rug, far too bright for the muted house. He began crawling toward the hallway's end, but stopped dead at the rug's edge. Every time he reached that border, he froze, turned back, and crawled in another direction. It was like an invisible barrier surrounded that rug one he knew not to cross. I sat with him until he drifted off around 2:30. My shoulders loosened. Weird kid. Weird rules. But harmless. Then the clock hit 3 a.m. That was when the job stopped feeling normal. I sighed, remembering the rule. The security check. It sounded ridiculous, but I didn't want to break contract terms. So, I walked to the front door, a heavy, old oak thing. I pressed my ear to it. For 10 seconds, I heard nothing but the distant sound of crickets. Then came a low hum. Not the wind, not the fridge. A deep, mechanical vibration, pulsing through the wood into my skull, like a massive generator idling right outside. I backed away, heart hammering, but the rules weren't done. In the kitchen, the back door waited, a glass-paned one overlooking a fenced yard drowned in darkness. I placed my hand on the cold brass knob. Instantly, the humming grew louder. This time, I could feel it, the house itself vibrating. Then came another sound, a soft, deliberate scrape. 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 It came from beneath the door, like something dragging across the floorboards from the other side. I snatched my hand away. The sound stopped immediately. For a long moment, there was only silence. My pulse thudded in my ears. Against all reason, I forced myself to put my hand back on the doorknob. The scraping resumed, perfectly in rhythm. I crouched, eye level with the small gap under the door. Nothing visible, but then thump, wet and heavy, like raw meat hitting wood. Right on the other side. I stumbled backward, nearly knocking over a chair. The noises stopped. The air seemed to thicken, heavy with something unseen. That was when the truth began to creep in. The rules weren't for Julian. They were for whatever was outside. The fixed temperature, the sealed windows, the confinement to the rug, and the 3 a.m. door ritual, all of it was containment. Something was out there, and the routine was keeping it in check. I hurried back to Julian's room. He was sound asleep, face peaceful. The rug glowed faintly in the dim hall light, like it was holding something at bay. I sat on the couch after that, staring at the clock until my eyes burned. Every creak sounded like a whisper. Every shadow seemed alive. Around 4:45 a.m., I had to use the bathroom. The hall groaned beneath my feet, the old floorboards complaining. And then I heard it. A voice. Faint, low, and humming an off-key lullaby. It was coming from Julian's room. I froze. The child was asleep. No one else was in the house. I crept to the doorway. The sound continued, a woman's voice, monotone, singing through the wall opposite Julian's crib. I stepped inside, my heart slamming against my ribs. On that wall stood an old wardrobe, tall and dark, its surface reflecting my shaking hand. I touched it. It was ice cold. The lullaby stopped instantly. I pressed my ear to the wood silence. Then a sudden, harsh snort, followed by a slow, ragged exhale. Something was breathing behind the wardrobe. I stumbled back, gasping. My brain scrambled for logic. Maybe a vent? A broken pipe? No. It was breathing. That's when Maria's rule about the temperature hit me. 68 degrees at all times? Whatever was behind that wardrobe, it needed the cold. I looked at Julian. Peaceful. Unbothered. Used to it. My thoughts spiraled into desperate theories. Maybe Maria was hiding someone, an ill relative, mentally unstable, maybe dangerous. Someone who sang through the wall to soothe the boy. The humming outside could have been a generator, powering a cooling unit. The scraping, a signal from another caretaker. But another possibility clawed its way into my head, the one that made my blood run cold. Julian wasn't the one being protected. He was the offering. The house, the rug, the routine, all designed to keep something satisfied. Something ancient, hungry, and patient. The rest of that night stretched on forever. I sat frozen on the couch, staring into the dark hall like it might move. Every pop of the old wood, every gust of wind outside sounded alive. I told myself over and over, just keep the routine. That's what Maria said. Stick to the rules and everything stays normal. But normal had long since left the building. By 6 a.m., I heard the familiar click of keys in the door. Maria stepped inside, shoulders slumped, eyes hollow. "Everything all right?" she asked softly. I swallowed, forcing calm. Yeah, routine was fine. Julian woke up once, but we stayed on the rug. The way her body eased when I said routine. It was like she'd been holding her breath for hours. "Good," she murmured. "That's good." She didn't ask about the doors, or the scraping, or the singing. She didn't have to. She just needed to hear that I'd done my part, that I'd kept it under control. As I packed up my bag, I couldn't help myself. I had to know. "Maria," I said carefully. I heard noises from the closet near Julian's room. I thought it might be the pipes. She froze. Her back went stiff, and for a full 10 seconds she didn't move. When she finally spoke, her voice was flat. "That's just the old house," she said. "There's nothing in there. You were mistaken." Her tone wasn't reassuring, it was warning. Before I could respond, Julian started crying from his room. Maria turned toward the sound, and something about her changed. The exhaustion dropped away, replaced by something sharper. Her movement slowed, deliberate. Her back straightened. She looked taller. She walked down the hall with a strange, predatory grace, like someone slipping into a familiar role. And when she entered Julian's room, I heard it again, that same tuneless lullaby from before. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the wall. It was coming from Maria. I stepped to the doorway. She was holding Julian, rocking him back and forth. Her back faced the wardrobe. And as she sang, her eyes weren't on the child. They were fixed on the small silver key hanging around her neck. Her fingers were clamped tight around it, white-knuckled. That's when I realized I'd been wrong about everything. There wasn't someone hidden behind that wardrobe. There wasn't a creature outside the door waiting to come in. There was only Maria and whatever she was fighting inside her own head. The house wasn't built to contain something else. It was built to contain her. The routine wasn't superstition, it was control. Every rule, every ritual, every restriction was her way of holding a fractured mind together. The 3 a.m. door checks, they weren't security patrols. They were grounding exercises, sensory anchors she needed to keep her two selves from switching places. The sitter wasn't hired to protect the boy. She was hired to protect reality, to make sure Maria stayed on the right side of her own madness. And the terrifying part? It worked. Until it didn't. A few weeks later, I saw her name again in the newspaper. The headline was short and merciless. "Single mother dies in house fire. Child rescued by neighbor." The article said it started in a closet near the child's room. The fire never spread beyond that small section of the house. Julian survived, thanks to a neighbor who heard him crying. But what gutted me was the last line of the report. The neighbor attempted to enter through the back door, but said the doorknob was too cold to touch, and the lock appeared to be sealed from the inside. The key was never found. That cold doorknob, that was her. That was Maria, or the other part of her, the one she called the keeper in the contract title I'd never understood, the perpetual sitter. It wasn't about me. It was about her, the endless sitter, the fragment of her mind that stayed awake through every night, watching, guarding, maintaining the balance. The keeper had been doing the same thing I had done, checking doors, maintaining temperature, keeping the rug boundaries intact, holding the line between sanity and something far worse. And when the balance finally broke, the keeper burned it all. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe it was deliberate. But the fire didn't spread, just like the rules, just like the system. It stayed confined, contained, controlled. Even in death, she kept the boundaries. I never babysat again after that. Couldn't. Every time I see a rug too bright for its surroundings, I feel the air go cold. Every time I hear humming through a wall, I freeze. Sometimes at night, when the house gets quiet and the heater kicks on, I swear I can hear it, that same low scrape, 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 just beneath the noise of the wind. And the moment it starts, I know what time it is. 3 a.m. That's when I remember her voice, low and trembling. Just stick to the routine. The routine is everything. And I do. I check my doors. I listen to the silence. I wait for the scraping to stop. Because deep down, I'm terrified that if I ever break the routine, whatever she was keeping out might finally decide it's time to come in.